Hello, everyone, and welcome. I see a few folks joining the webinar. It's great to have you here. I just wanted to thank you for joining today's discussion on local strategies to advance Black prosperity. My name is Kimberly Burrows, and I'm a Senior Manager of Training and Technical Assistance at the Urban Institute. I'm sure, as many of you know, there still remains significant disparities between Black and white families in this country. As of 2022, Black families held $15 in wealth for every $100 held by white families. Additionally, this year, cuts to the federal workforce, where Black Americans have traditionally been overrepresented at about 19%, have disrupted stable career pathways. These pathways have historically enabled Black families to enter the middle class, purchase homes, and pursue upward mobility and stability. It's clear that pathways to economic mobility for Black individuals and families, including higher education and small business development, are increasingly under threat. This makes it critical that we identify new avenues for Black households, not just to survive, but to thrive. The shift in policy landscape at the federal level means that local strategies are more essential than ever. So in today's webinar, we are very excited to elevate some innovative data tools and share promising practices that support Black prosperity and wealth building in cities across the US. Our goal here today is to showcase some strategies that can expand opportunity and strengthen the ability for Black families to compete in today's economy. The Urban Institute partnered with the Black Wealth Data Center to examine opportunities for Black prosperity. And with this welcome, I will now pass on to my colleague, Christina Prinville, to run through everything that we have for you all today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christina Prenville. I'm a research analyst here at the Urban Institute. So here's what you can expect over the next 75 minutes. First, we'll start with a presentation from Noah McDaniel. He's a research associate here at Urban. He'll walk us through Urban's recently developed small business landscape and ecosystem diagnostic, which is a conceptual framework for assessing the capacity of local and regional areas to support and develop small businesses. The tool will officially be launched in the upcoming weeks. Then we'll move into a fire chat with experts Brett Theodos, Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute, Andre Folks, President of StartCo, and Ellen Shepard, CEO, Principal of Community Allies. They'll discuss how local leaders might apply the tools to their own local conditions. Finally, we'll close off with a panel discussion with Leslie Ford and Michael Neal from the Urban Institute and Harshal Malashua of the Black Wealth Data Center. They will be in conversation with Kimberly Burrows on strategies for advancing Black wealth creation. We'll be leaving some time for questions from the audience after the panel, but biographies for all our speakers and the other related materials are available online. So feel free to check those out for more background. So a few quick housekeeping notes before we begin. All participants are muted, but you can type your questions or comments into the Q&A box at any time. We'll try to address some of your questions during the panel discussion and Q&A segment at the end. Lastly, this session is being recorded and the recording will be shared afterward. With that said, let's get started. I'm excited to kick off things by passing it on to Noel McDaniel, who'll walk us through the diagnostic.
Thank you, Christina. As Christina mentioned, I'm a researcher here at Urban, and along with my colleague Brett Theodos, who you'll be hearing from later, we developed a small business landscape diagnostic tool. One of the many strategies that are relevant for developing household wealth, and particularly Black wealth, is investing and supporting in small business landscapes. What is a small business landscape? This is the broader context and relationships that influence and surround small business development in a place, whether that's a small town or a big city. This includes the conditions of the labor market, lenders, investors, capital providers, business support organizations, philanthropies and foundations, local government, and the connections between them and relationships between this context. The diagnostic tool that we've developed is a data tool for local stakeholders, whether that's the mayor's office, a local community and economic development office, or local entrepreneurial and business support organizations, to self-assess their local small business ecosystem's capacity across several indicators that we've developed, measure it against other places. There are a few possible use cases for the diagnostic that we've identified. This includes quantifying how your place compares across key indicators of capacity of small business ecosystems. It could be useful just to frame questions you might already have or to reveal new questions about how to assess and evaluate small business ecosystems. It can inform ways to develop your own methods for assessing small business development using the data sources that we have identified and suggested, or just to identify strategies for supporting small businesses based on the trends and patterns that you might see in the data that we'll be introducing shortly. So what's included in the diagnostic? We've identified 20 indicators across 5 key areas. These are small business presence and representation, lending and access to capital, the small business development support system, private associations of businesses, and local government support. We've used nationally available data to calculate and develop 9 indicators for large cities and counties, and the remaining 11 indicators will be dependent on locally accessible data, and some of which are place dependent. To determine the indicators, we had an iterative process of consulting with subject matter experts, ecosystem builders, and economic development practitioners. We compiled locally available data sources for cities and counties on the presence of small business and lending. So this includes things like the Census Bureau's American Community Survey, bank disclosure data, CDFI lending data, and other sources of information on business development. We then took those data and ranked places, either cities or counties, based on the distribution of data for each indicator to produce a 5-point scale to measure whether places are in the middle or trending higher or lower in each indicator. And you'll see what I mean shortly. So now I'll walk through what's included in the diagnostic and how to use it. When you open up the diagnostic, you'll also be downloading an associated table of data for each of the 9 indicators for which we provide nationally available data, as I mentioned before. So users will be able to filter the data to their place, and then for each indicator, there will be a value and a rank. So you can fill in the diagnostic for each indicator with the value and the associated rank to see how your place compares. So now I'll be walking through each of the sections of the diagnostic itself. So this is a document that will shortly be available on urban.org that you can download along with the data. You'll be able to see this webinar once it's recorded, as well as an example of the diagnostic tool itself, so you can see what it might look like when it's fully built out. So looking first at the first section, small business presence, the first indicator is the share of employment in microbusinesses. For each indicator, there's a place to fill in the value that you look up on the table that I'd shared earlier, as well as a place to circle or highlight the associated rank. So you can see that we've developed a 5-point scale ranging from underperforming to exceeding expectations. Something that I want to point out is that this isn't necessarily a value judgment per se of what we think is good or bad, but a relative ranking of where a place falls compared to others. This might, if your particular place underperforms or exceeds expectations, that's up for a local expert to decide whether that's good or bad. Where we think that this is valuable is in contextualizing the data and understanding where you fall relative to other places, and allowing for local users and people who are embedded in communities to interpret and understand what that actually means in the context. For each indicator, we also provide the data and methods, either the data that we used and collected to calculate the indicators, or, as I'll show later, the recommended data that we suggest that you use to fill in on the local data. Additionally, we provide a little bit of context on why we think each indicator matters. So in the case of the share of employment in microbusinesses, we think that this is important to measure because microbusinesses, these are businesses with fewer than 20 employees, contribute to a sense of place. So these are flower shops, auto body mechanics, small cafes, the kind of Main Street businesses that you might encounter on a day-to-day basis. So I'll just move along and introduce some of the other concepts that we've developed for this diagnostic. These are not exhaustive, but we think that they're fairly comprehensive and reflect a broad sense of the kinds of things that are important for small business ecosystems. We also measure the share of employment in small and medium businesses. These are firms that are more innovative, more dynamic, and tend to be an important source of local development. We also measure the non-employer businesses, and we scale this by working age population. Something you'll notice across the board is that in order to compare places to each other, we scale by something like working age population or employment, so that we can get a comparable indicator rather than just a total number. And this is especially relevant when you're comparing between places like New York City, which has over 8 million people, versus a smaller place that may only have 100 or 2,000 people. The non-employer businesses in a place are important to keep note of because these are businesses that could potentially transition into employment given the right set of circumstances or supports. We also measure the share of businesses producing traded goods. These are the firms that are located in specialized markets that then export around the country or even internationally. And we think that this is suggestive of an economy that is robust enough to support specialized industries, which tend to be more innovative and have higher compensation than others. The second section is lending and access to capital. Here we measure bank business lending, SBA guaranteed lending, and CDFI lending, and venture capital investment. So for bank business lending, we've used data from Community Reinvestment Act disclosures to measure lending per employee. This, we think, is a high-level indicator of the access to capital for medium-sized businesses. Similarly, we measure lending through the SBA 7A guarantee program, which suggests access to capital for businesses that might not otherwise be able to access conventional bank credit in a place. Similarly, we have an indicator for the SBA's 504 real estate lending program. We also developed an indicator for CDFI microlending and small business lending using data disclosed from the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund. CDFIs fill important gaps in markets where banks aren't present or aren't lending to especially small businesses. So this is an indicator of small business ecosystems that are able to support businesses on that growth trajectory towards conventional financial services. Similarly, we also think it's important to measure angel and seed deals as well as venture capital deals. And I'll note that this is the point at which the availability of national data is much more sparse. And here is really where local data is going to be important. So for local practitioners that are filling in this diagnostic, they might need to consult, say, a state database on venture capital deals or purchase a privately available source such as PitchBook in order to access this data. Moving on to section 3, the small business development support system. Here we think that the operating budget of nonprofit BSOs is a valuable indicator of the overall capacity to support small businesses in a market. So to do so, for instance, we suggest looking at the IRS Form 990 for BSOs in your market and tallying the operating budget for all those organizations. Again, this is something where there's no good national database of these types of organizations where we can easily calculate this data for every place simultaneously, but something that we think can relatively easily be done at the local level. We also have an indicator for philanthropic grant making, similarly, which will go through a similar process to the previous indicator. Section 4 is private associations of businesses. These are peer networking affiliations and organizations, such as chambers of commerce, business improvement districts, and neighborhood-based alliances, as well as the presence of major employers or institutions, such as hospitals or colleges and universities, with small business hiring and contracting commitments. And the final section is local government support. So these are the policies and programs in local and state government, county and state governments that influence small business ecosystems in terms of land use, access to credit, and business development support. So these are things like the share of public procurement that's going towards small businesses, the staffing and spending in business development service and economic development offices, things like preferential zoning for small businesses and land use policy that encourages commercial development, as well as the influence of policy and regulation on business costs. And this includes things like tax incentives, rebates, licensing and permitting, and access to transportation and utilities. So we're excited to announce that this diagnostic and associated data will be launching shortly on Urban's website. When you access the data, please consider sharing your feedback after using it. We'll be providing an email to do so. We really think of this as being a beta test and a proof of concept of ways to evaluate small business ecosystems. And we think it's really important to hear back from local users and practitioners on what their use cases are, how they're using the data, and other ways of thinking about these problems that we can then reflect in future iterations of this work. So with that, I'll hand things over to Brett Theodos.
Thanks so much, Noah. Thanks, everybody, for joining the webinar. Good to see friends on our list. I am hoping that y'all join in with questions that you pop in our Q&A box, and we'll try to fold them in. So if we can pull down this slide and welcome up Andre and Ellen, we're going to have a bit of a moderated fireside chat about the actual work of ecosystem building. So you've heard one way that we have tried to bring some sense making to this space in terms of understanding capacities that exist locally. And now we get to hear from the experts who really are doing the work of building those ecosystems. And so I am excited to welcome them both here in this dialogue, and they will be weaving in a good amount of their personal experience and learning over the years. And you've got full bio blurbs there on the website, but just very quickly to say that Andre leads a venture development organization which he co-founded called StartCo. He's based in Memphis, and from that perch, he's been working to support the small business ecosystem, especially with some work on some higher tech or higher growth potential sectors for underrepresented entrepreneurs. And Ellen is based in Chicago and is leading a CEO of a group called Community Allies, and there has been working to support organizations in multiple markets to uplift locally owned businesses, underrepresented entrepreneurs, entrepreneurs of color, and in a number of markets, in particular, a deep engagement in San Antonio, but she'll be drawing on those experiences. So these are the folks that we get to hear from, and I just want to help make it a little bit plain for our audience. Like, what is an ecosystem? What are we talking about here? How does it matter? How does it show up? So we're going to take a step back from the deep dive of the tool to have some of these bigger picture conversations and implications. So whoever wants to kick us off, could we just start with how, why do ecosystems matter? They're nebulous, but yet also can be very concrete in some instances, with an eye for entrepreneurs, with an eye to Black entrepreneurs. Who wants to kick us off?
Sure. I'm happy to hop in. Well, thanks, Brett. Great question. I think there's a couple of ways to look at it. One, if you're thinking about small business and entrepreneurial ecosystems, they are major contributors to the regional economy. And what we've been seeing across the country is our net job creation in terms of entrepreneurship isn't where it used to be 30, 40 years ago. And we can be doing much better to kind of bolster the advocacy, policy, and capital pursuits with regards to that. Because what we're struggling with here in Memphis is we're noticing that our young firms, we're creating a lot of jobs, but we're destroying a lot of jobs as well. And so to have an ecosystem that starts to push that forward, where there's greater job creation with young firms to also work with our large firms who hold most of our jobs in our community, we think is critical. At the same time, if you're at the firm level, an entrepreneur or an existing business, it's hard to go alone. So you need help from partners and supporters that are out there. Now, we must go beyond just what I kind of consider check the box solutions where you have certain funders and supporters who say, okay, we helped a couple of organizations. That's all we need to do in our community. We really have to look into the journey of the entrepreneur and the business owner, understand the situation that they're in. What are their environments for peer learning, self-learning, and also kind of moving them forward? Are they in destructive environments that we need to address? At the same time, are our ecosystems speaking to the skills they need, the domain and solution expertise to help them build their businesses? And then obviously, when you think about the village of support of existing resources that ESOs, governments, private sector, capital funds might want to provide. So these are very critical, in our opinion, in terms of trying to move small businesses and entrepreneurs forward.
Thank you. Ellen, what do you want to add there?
Yeah, it's a great explanation. When I think about small business ecosystems and the why, I mean, I think first about some of the statistics that we heard earlier about the disparities in Black wealth and why entrepreneurship is such a critical part of that picture. There was a study from UNLV a few years ago that showed that the median net worth for Black business owners was, I think they said, like 12 times higher than for business for Black non-business owners. We know that Black and Brown owned businesses tend to hire more Black and Brown employees, and so there's not just individual wealth, but family wealth and community wealth that gets translated through this kind of business ownership. And then when we think about these support systems, um, what multiple studies and thinkers have found about this now is that it's not just about the presence of individual services or individual capital providers or even equitable access to those things, although obviously that's really important. It's about the whole being greater than the sum of the parts. And if you have an ecosystem approach, then when a business owner enters that system at any point, they can find their way. If those different service providers are connected to each other, they can help that business owner navigate to the services they need. The business owners are more likely to enter the system because part of that system is community-based, culturally relevant and fluent, language fluent providers who those business owners trust so they can get into the system. Um, and also, those organizations are better able to measure success, right? Because they're hopefully working together and they have set some joint goals and have some joint ways of measuring what's actually working so that their efforts can be focused, not just a hodgepodge of services that kind of get thrown out for people to use.
I have done scores of interviews with entrepreneurs and with lenders, be they mission or mainstream lenders, with business support or entrepreneur support organizations, advisory services, technical assistance, whatever we want to call it. And over, they will talk about how poorly coordinated, aligned, how hard it is, referrals, things change, they don't themselves. Is that what you're getting at? Those linkages and connections are where an ecosystem lives or dies?
Yeah, I think I would say a couple things about that. One is yes, it's linkages and connections because a business owner doesn't know that if they go in a certain door or make a certain call or send a certain email, they don't know that that is the right service for them or not. And so it's up to that service provider to know the rest of the ecosystem to be able to say, this might be the best place for you. And we're going to track you in some way through that system so that it's a warm handoff to a trusted resource. And hopefully, there's some sort of tracking system so that that service provider can see, did that person make it to the other service provider? What happens after that? And one further thing I will say is that all of this requires trust building between the different service providers who may have years of sense of competition or a sense of being divided geographically or culturally or racially or in terms of access to power that they all have. So there's some very human and relationship oriented elements to this as well.
So we're going to come back if we have time to some of the measurement and priority setting things. But Andre, I want to come to you next. Just how do you do the work of ecosystem building? What does it take? how long does it take? Is it ever done or not done? How do you know if you've achieved success? Because some of the disparities that we're talking about are so much beyond the small business space. What can we realistically be solving for? How are we doing it in environments where cities are face fiscal constraints? States may be engaged or they may be completely checked out. Just help us understand the actual work of ecosystem building.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk for hours on that, but I think, for us in particular, looking at the Black business ecosystem here, going about 10 years or so ago, we just noticed some huge disparities with regards to employer firms versus non-employer firms. So, we had about 40,000 Black firms, but only 800 had paid employees. A collective only doing about 1 billion, in terms of annual revenue. And so we saw there's just these huge disparities and gaps that existed. And I think, we had to all look at the data and dig in and put a foundational layer of where we're actually at as a community first and get folks to agree to that. And then at the same time, advocate for how we can put together what I kind of consider a value delivery system. It's one thing to have all the different resource providers, all the different doors that you walk in to get those resources. But if we haven't tried to organize a system that delivers value to the entrepreneur where the entrepreneur is on their journey, then we're just kind of spraying resources out there. And so what we wanted to do was start testing this, right? Because you can't take on that huge disparity all at once. And so I recommend the communities start testing this, get the partner alignment that you need to kind of carry it forward. And an example of that here is a More for Memphis effort that we're doing with Seeding Success, our chamber, our economic development growth engine in the city, where we're forcing the alignment around workforce, entrepreneurship, capital provision, and then place-based investing. And so we're all in the room together. We're hearing what everyone's working on real time. We're sharing resources real time. And so that's a way of just like starting to test and demonstrate, and then you expand from there. And I think that's the key versus thinking we can solve it all at once. And so, that's what we recommend. And then at the same time, double down when you see successes, right? I think a lot of times our funders will move away from something once they've done it for a few years. So we want to kind of take more of a startup approach, double down when you see successes and keep expanding and scaling the system. And so that's just a little bit on some things we've been doing.
In addition to what I hear from entrepreneurs about confusion, not sure which door to enter, feeling like they're not warm handoffs and uncertainty how to proceed. The other thing I hear over and over again is the supports I'm getting are too generic, they're not specialized, they're not high quality enough, they don't move me forward in a meaningful way. Is that what you're getting at with we need that level of specialization in our ecosystem? The ecosystem needs to function, but we also need the parts of the ecosystem to function. Is that what you're?
Yeah, so I mean, at the end of the day, we ESOs and providers have to evaluate ourselves and the technical provision that we provide. We can't just assume that what we've been providing for decades is what they need. And so as you see things changing with regards of technology, artificial intelligence, we have to adapt in terms of our service provision. So we have to truly have some introspection and upgrade what we're doing to meet them where they are. So absolutely.
Helen, over to you on the how do we do ecosystem building? What does it take? How long it take? Environmental conditions, et cetera.
Yeah, I love that Andre said that you don't have to do it all at once, but it's great to enter at a place and test and then double down on the successes. There's a graphic that we put together that shows the ecosystem as a whole. I think someone on the UI team is going to throw that in the chat. But I also think that those kinds of graphics are super intimidating because you can't do it all at once. And you shouldn't, because the priorities for your place are going to be different from what a different place is. We also would start with getting a bunch of people in a room talking about these things. And that sounds so simple, but it's also fairly revolutionary because often these folks have not been in a room together. either because they've been competing or because who has time and resources to do it. But when you kind of get the joint wisdom of all the different people looking at different parts of the ecosystem together, you start to immediately get some synergies. I have seen really successful ecosystems come both from like a holistic of all the lenders and all the funders and all of the BSOs and all of the like everybody in a room together, and have it be very structured, type down hierarchical, like you think of a typical nonprofit with a board and committees. And I've also seen efforts that are very successful that are much more informal and really get sparked just from making those connections. I always think about an example from one of the big cities we worked in where we brought together a group of people that just happened to include one of the heads of the local, very giant chamber of commerce and a very grassroots business support activist person who never would have thought that they would like each other. But by being in the same room and realizing they were on the same page, they started working together and resourcing each other. And it sparked all sorts of stuff that started to then have impact on the businesses in their community. All of which is to say, I think the ecosystems can look different ways, and it's okay to jump in with who you have and what you have.
Love that. That's a hopeful and practical sentiment there. I did a memo for DC's council in the COVID era when they were thinking about how to use their COVID stimulus funds and what to trade off. And it struck me at the time that we needed much more precision around what we were trying to achieve. Because if we were trying to achieve, for example, overcoming the gaps in who owns a business, that might lead us to make a bunch of small grants or very small microloans and start a bunch of solopreneur businesses. That has potential real value in community and for community serving work, and also as an income generating strategy for people. On the other hand, if we're trying to overcome, say, the wealth gap, that means we need to make some wealth. And those very small businesses, very few of them move into that territory. And so we might need to take more of a look at firms with high growth potential, but that puts us in a potentially different market, even within a demographic, but a different market. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at is, and our diagnostic, my hope, my humble hope is it's something of a conversation tool by which people can begin to think through the different capacities in their place. But that dovetails with priorities. And so in your experiences, how do we actually get at this thing of ecosystem strength and really in a way that helps us think through what our priorities are and should be, even presuming for the moment that we're bought into, we want to grow and diversify our businesses. But what does that mean? And how do we know where our extra marginal, $1 million of city budget or philanthropy budget should go? And so how do we set priorities? How do we understand ecosystems? And what would you advise for those on the call who are doing that work?
Yeah, so just a couple of thoughts there. One thing that we've been looking at is looking at more of an open innovation system for our ecosystem and better understanding at all stages of firm development, whether it's a startup, whether it's at the commercialization level, whether it's at market expansion. What we noticed was there hasn't been as intentional development of talent, technology, and capital at the startup and commercialization stages compared to big firms that we attract and try to cultivate and grow. And so that then starts to beg a lot of questions where you get a lot of ideas of what we could do around that. And so, give you an example, the Black Chamber of Memphis was really honed in on loss of wealth, right? A lot of times we're talking about creation of wealth. They were seeing that as people had no succession plan for their businesses, a lot of that Black wealth and revenue from their companies would go to a white company after they passed on. And so I think the key is how do you take that idea and move it into a system of change, right? And so at the end of the day, you have to kind of agitate and disrupt to get people's attention. You have to have the idea and then come up with the reform to execute it and carry it forward. And then you need to manage and scale it kind of up from there. And so I think just overall, you have to have some kind of context of evaluation, whether it's doing inventory analysis, looking at what's happening in other areas of economic development in comparison, and then that sparks idea. What I noticed is many ecosystems aren't investing in the R&D needed for those ideas to kind of flourish, grow, and get results.
Last word, Ellen, unfortunately.
Yeah,
Over to
I would
you.
just pile onto that quickly with first of all, the idea of they're not investing in the results. I think one of the most frustrating things of ecosystem work is when you get a lot of people into a room, you start working on something, and then it's like, and we have no resources for implementation. So starting to think about that from the beginning is really important. I would just offer a couple of examples by way of answer to your question about how to know when to start or where to start, Brett. Um, just for example, in San Antonio, when the larger group came together, they realized that where there was the biggest gap was in the place-based um, business services provision. San Antonio is a immigrant welcoming community, and so they had a lot of there was a great deal of importance on culturally relevant services and geographic services, and those organizations tended to be under-resourced. And so the initial ecosystem hub really started with those very place-based, neighborhood-based business service providers. In Richmond, Virginia, they realized what their businesses most needed. Again, after the studies and after the group conversations, they focused on an online navigation system to the services that businesses needed, and that was their entry into the work. So I think the numbers, the kind of assessment that Urban Institute provides, and the group discussions, you start to bubble up with where you're going to start.
Love it. So much more we could discuss, and we need to. We need to keep this dialogue going. So for those on the call, Andre and Ellen are the RailWorks and ecosystem building. So they are good examples to point to of processes that are engaging and making a difference locally. And for our part, with respect to the diagnostic tool, we are very much conceptualizing it as a beta, and we want your feedback and input as we continue to refine it and think about how to roll it out more broadly. So thank you. And with that, I will pass it over to Kimberly.
Thanks, Brett.
Thank you all for helping to frame this conversation. I think it's just so important to consider how small business entrepreneurship are just, one of several strategies towards building wealth. And you all, really grounded us in that conversation. And it's my pleasure to broaden this wealth conversation even further by inviting a few folks to join me on the screen to have this discussion with me. Leslie Ford and Michael Neal, my colleagues at the Urban Institute, and Harsha Malajusala, who is the data director at the Black Wealth Data Center. And very much excited to just kick off a conversation with the four of you. We've been talking a lot about wealth, and especially with that last question, Andre and Ellen had these important insights on the gap. And we know from research there is that persistent gap in wealth accumulation and wealth preservation between Black and white families. And when we're grounded in this idea of wealth, it's not just the income piece, it's also property, it's also other assets. And even looking at all of these, that gap still remains. And so I would just love to hear from you as we start off this conversation. Why does the wealth gap exist? What are some of those historical systemic barriers that we should be aware of as we're thinking about strategies to both build and preserve Black wealth? And Leslie, I'd love to invite you to kick off this conversation on, where is the gap? Why does it exist?
Sure. Thank you so much, Kimberly, and thank you for having us this afternoon. I think one of the most important things that we should always keep in mind when we talk about like wealth and wealth building is the reality that wealth begets wealth. And the origins of the racial wealth gap can be directly traced in this country to longstanding historical conditions and structural factors. So centuries of enslavement and the extraction of labor and ingenuity of enslaved people, subsequent periods of indentured servitude and Jim Crow segregation, persistent barriers to education, employment, and wealth building opportunities laid the foundation for the economic inequities that persist today. Michael will say more about this, but as a result of the history and the present day conditions, Black families have not been able to accumulate or pass down wealth from generation to generation in the same ways that white families have. And it's important to note that for decades, federal policies were designed to support white Americans in creating and in building wealth, but they were not similarly designed to support Black Americans. So I'm just going to briefly just touch on a few that I think are important for, us all to sort of be aware of as we enter this conversation. So beginning in the 1930s, the FHA insured long-term low down payment mortgages, making homeownership possible and affordable for millions of Americans. By refusing, however, to insure mortgages in and near African American neighborhoods, the FHA accelerated patterns of residential segregation. This is important because homes backed by FHA mortgages tended to increase in value and gain equity over time. So Black families were locked out of homeownership and the appreciation of those homes in those places. And at the same time, the federal government also helped to subsidize new housing in America's suburbs, and developers of those suburbs were required to include racial covenants that barred or blocked Black families from securing FHA mortgages there as well. Similarly, it's well documented that the GI Bill helped to afford Americans with clear pathways to the middle class through homeownership and education. And while the GI Bill was written to be race neutral, systemic racism, segregation, and discriminatory local implementation effectively excluded most Black World War II veterans from fully accessing its benefits. And so local administrators of the GI Bill were actually enforcing and reinforcing Jim Crow laws. They denied loans, they limited college access to segregated institutions, cut off benefits. So this meant that only a tiny fraction of Black veterans actually received benefits or help compared to white veterans. So with all of that in mind, as we think about building wealth, we have to keep in mind not only these deep historic inequities and the ways that federal policies reinforced these inequities. We also have to keep in mind income inequality today and how it makes it really difficult for families to build wealth. So I'll just briefly touch on the data shows that the Black-white income inequality gap is large, it is persistent, and it has not meaningfully closed in decades. White earners tend to make substantially more on average, and white households have nearly double the median income of Black households. And we know that income and an appropriate debt to income ratio is really important. It's critical because it's what enables individuals and households to be able to engage in other financial actions. So savings, home ownership, retirement, education, all of this requires more income than debt. So without sufficient income, it is, of course, very difficult to save, to invest, to plan for retirement. So the reality is that Black families not only have less income, but they're also more likely to carry more debt. And that their debt tends to take up a larger proportion of their salaries every month. And it isn't the type of debt that helps people. So it's not debt that helps build equity like in a home. It's debt that takes up larger portions of income, like student loan debt. So the data shows that 1 in 4 Black households have zero to negative wealth. And when families are in that type of financial situation, they're much more likely to rely on credit cards, on medical debt, and on shorter term, higher interests loans just to cover their basic needs. So the last point I'll make to your point about access to capital, we know that the research is clear and that access to capital for Black individuals and for Black institutions like HBCUs can be really challenging. Black businesses, for example, tend to start with less capital and have more difficulty securing loans. Black entrepreneurs tend to face hurdles, which means that they tend to receive less initial capital and loans compared to their white counterparts, despite similar performance. And so to help individuals, to help households, to help institutions build wealth, we have to keep in mind and redress some of these historical harms and address the present day conditions.
Leslie, thank you so much for, really sharing the domino effect of what can happen for Black families. And Michael, I'd love to turn to you to see if there's anything you'd like to add as we're talking about this wealth gap that exists.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent foundation. And forgive me, let me reintroduce myself. My name is Michael Neal. I serve as a senior fellow here at the Urban Institute in what's called our Housing Finance Policy Center. And you know, at least when I think back, I think, number one, certainly, we see, as Leslie mentioned, the typical Black family, will have less income. At the same time, certainly they have what we call a higher marginal propensity to consume out of that income. That
Mhm.
is that the proportion of their income that they use to spend tends to be higher, coupled with, that in and of itself leaves, less room ultimately for being able to build wealth in kind of a neoclassical kind of way. But at the same time, and I think it's really critical here that certainly sustainability is a key part of the conversation as well. That is that we continue to see both not just the lack of being able to build that wealth, but also when that wealth building has taken place, the propensity of it being lost can be greater. Whether that's losing your small business, whether that's losing your home, whether that's even losing your job. All of those all speak to and all disproportionately impact, all disproportionately impact Black families. And I'll say, I think, some interesting work that my colleague Mingli Zong is doing here at the Urban Institute points out that, not only are younger Black families less likely to receive inheritances, but they're also more likely to give financial support to their older families. And certainly that needs to be discussed in a broader setting, not just in a profit and loss kind of conversation, because you're providing important help to your family. That is critical. That should be a part of the conversation. But from a pure calculating standpoint, it also can reduce the amount of wealth building that one family is able to have relative to another. Certainly stands in contrast to the way that we've seen, other families operate. And so, all of that I think really speaks to and really sits
Mhm.
ultimately within the context of what's going on in the world. We heard conversations around AI. We've heard, as Leslie pointed out, certainly the history of structural racism, economic recessions, the ups and downs of the economy, climate change. All of that has the effect of ultimately impacting those that are more vulnerable. And at the same time, what we see is that that recovery all tends to be slower as well, if it happens at all. And so even over those types of catastrophes, the foundation that has really been set up to inform less wealth building among the typical Black family, ultimately can itself contribute to wider gaps over time.
Mhm. Thank you, Michael, because I think, really trying to lay the foundation of why this is happening is just so critical. And I know that there are folks that might now ask the question of, okay, well, how do you know? How do you know that the gap continues to grow in some areas? And why is that happening? And Harsha, I really want to bring you into the conversation. From your position at the Black Wealth Data Center, I know that there are several data that you use that starts to really illuminate some of these disparities and understanding, okay, what is happening trend-wise over time? Could you tell us a little bit about what are some of the types of data that are most critical for understanding how Black households are accumulating wealth, especially based on some of Leslie and Michael's comments here? I think it's, so imperative for us to really get to the core of how do we know what we know? So I'd love to hear from you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Kimberly. Great to be in this panel with Michael and Leslie. I'm the Director of Data at the Blackwell Data Center. I'll start by sharing a little bit about the origin story of the Blackwell Data Center. Blackwell Data Center was launched in 2022 to address the issue of data that is inaccessible, incomplete, or missing. In the past 3 years, we've built one of the largest wealth data repositories in the United States. We have more than 80 data sets, 50 of them which are now publicly accessible on our platform, covering topics such as assets and debt, business ownership, education, employment, home ownership, climate, and health. A majority of our data comes from federal agencies, including the US Census, the Federal Reserve, the Department of Education, and the Small Business Administration. We are also procuring like richer data sets from the commercial sector to complement our federal data strategy. And you can go to blackwealthdata.org to explore all of our data offerings. Our platform is completely free. All we ask is for you to create a user profile to access our platform. In terms of like data points that show a picture of what's happening with Black Wealth, Leslie and Michael have like touched on like some of these data points as well. Just to look at what's happening in the area of business ownership, one key metric that researchers track is the annual receipt amount, especially if you're a small business. If your annual receipt amount or if your annual revenue is more than $1 million, then that says a lot about the longevity of your small business. When we look at this data, many Asian, white, and Hispanic firms fall in this category. The largest share of these firms have around $1 million or more in receipt. When you look at Black businesses, majority of the Black businesses, their annual revenue falls between $100,000 to $250,000. Again, when you look at the size of a Black business, it's most likely that you're either a sole proprietorship or you have between 1 to 4 employees. In terms of access to funding, Leslie's touched on this as well. We look at some of the most popular loans that are provided by the Small Business Administration. These loans are called 7A and 504 loans. Black borrowers have the lowest number of approvals for these loans. And similarly, when during the COVID-19 pandemic, the paycheck protection loans were given out by the Small Business Administration. Again, we saw that Black businesses had like the highest denial rates for the paycheck protection programs. Leslie and Michael have also talked and touched upon the importance of home ownership, especially when you're a small business owner. When you're securing your first loan, your home actually becomes a collateral for that loan. If you look at the overall home ownership rate in the United States, it's around 65%, but the Black home ownership rate is around 44%. So it's lagging behind 20 percentage points to the overall home ownership rate. Due to historical trends, we also know that properties in Black neighborhoods are typically undervalued, and Black households have the lowest median home or property values compared to other groups. And just talking about how the economy is doing in 2025, just by looking at unemployment rates in 2025, we know that by September of 2025, Black women actually have the highest unemployment rate in the United States. So these are like some data points that help us create a picture of how
Mhm.
the economy is trending in 2025. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you, Harsha. That's very helpful, especially hearing where we can find some of the data. I've been thinking a lot about, what happens if for timing or accuracy reasons, we may not have access to some of the data that traditionally we've been able to use to understand trends over time. What are some sort of innovative ways or partnerships that you all have seen to help fill those gaps? And wanted to acknowledge that, with the small business diagnostic tool, that's one way in which they're saying, okay, we'll couple the publicly accessible data with what we might have at that city or state level in order to fill the picture that might be fragmented otherwise. Kind of building on that, what have you all seen that could be used? And Michael, I'd love if you could start us off with this.
Yeah, hey, let me say that I think that there has been, you know, a large amount of energy in this direction, that, in some ways has been amplified, by by the risks that we face in the current moment. And, a couple things come to my mind. The first one certainly is is kind of the elephant in the room, and that is around wealth data at a local level. Certainly, data sets like the Survey of Consumer Finances, like the panel study of income dynamics, like the survey on income and program participation, all of those and a few others in one way or another certainly shed light on wealth disparities. But really into different degrees, really lack the ability to drive down to very local levels in a consistent way. And so, ways in which I think, ways in which I've seen that done either with the use of surveys in certain areas of the country, including DC. There's one going on in Boston right now, as well as other markets around the country, where that results in high touch, high cost. I think AI or the use of machine learning has been employed in this direction. Certainly work that we have done in the Urban Institute. My colleagues Aaron Williams and his co-authors have pushed in that direction. Others have pushed in that direction. And but at the same time, I think there's also this opportunity to combine kind of to push for data sources that may not necessarily always be used, but where maybe something like a machine learning technique can help out. And an example of that is where increasingly people have tried to connect with credit bureau data as a way of really understanding, particularly what happens, around a credit event. I'm taking out a loan, I am now not, that loan is now not performing. How do we understand the broader financial picture, that might determine those outcomes, but also might ultimately be implied by those outcomes. One of the challenges, though, and certainly those are now set up in ways that researchers and other stakeholders are able to access in a more cost-effective way. But of course, it lacks, the race and ethnicity of the consumer themselves. Certainly, you can match that with something like, the Census Bureau, the American Community Survey, to get the race of the geography, and that gives you some lens into racial differences. But certainly, that's secondary to knowing the race of the individual themselves. And so, where I think researchers have tried to solve that is again with the use of machine learning to effectively estimate or guesstimate, depending on your view, what the race is based on, a whole number of inputs, and that in turn helps to then drive, our deepen our understanding of racial inequities. Certainly, all of this is not perfect, but in a lot of ways, I think it's promising.
Mhm. I definitely appreciate the innovation of the machine learning example, and I think that's something that we can pilot and even learn more from in the coming years. Leslie, would love to hear if you have any examples of how folks can, think about when there's a data gap, what's an innovative strategy to fill that?
Sure, absolutely. So while not specifically focused on wealth and wealth building, I'm going to share an example that I think is translatable to like economic indicators, income, wealth data. So a small project team at Urban is facilitating a local working group process with the Skillman Foundation in Detroit. And the working group is comprised of education data stakeholders, and we're bringing together cross-sector leaders to explore how Michigan stakeholders can respond to the evolving landscape around K-12 education data. So, with an increasing risk to federal K-12 education data availability and quality, Michigan data experts and folks in that ecosystem want to be prepared to respond to any potential or forthcoming challenges to uh, the K-12 federal data. So Urban is serving as a facilitator. We're providing subject matter expertise, providing strategic guidance, and we're leading the group through a process where we're discussing how federal data changes and changes to education data policies are affecting Michigan students, things like school funding, district operations, and public access to data that impacts students and their families. And what we're doing is identifying a small set of equity-focused indicators that are locally meaningful, that different stakeholders that are involved in this group all share and use, and that warrant sort of long-term investment and protection. So we're working with them to identify these sets of indicators and how we can protect them and manage them going forward, irrespective of what happens at the federal level. And we're also exploring how to take advantage of current and future leadership transitions at the city and state level and policy windows to elevate and sort of insert some shared education data priorities into new policy agendas. There's an incoming mayor in Detroit, and there's going to be a new governor next year. So what we're doing, again, we're providing the group with regular updates on K-12 education data status, and we're aligning the group's goals with broader state initiatives. So ultimately, our goal is to help the group improve its local and state data infrastructure, to reduce duplication, to help strengthen this within city and cross-region and state coordination. So basically, we're just trying to ensure that all the localities and regions within Michigan, including stakeholders, so the users, the producers, data advocates, public and charter school districts, and other stakeholders still have access to the data that they need. And I mentioned this process that we're engaged in because I see a really strong connection between this work and this model and what can be done with with wealth and economic related data in localities. So we could potentially replicate a process like this in another city, in multiple cities, in states across the country. We could partner with localities to help them identify a set of core economic indicators, whether income related, wealth related, that can help cities and states monitor progress for Black families, for Black households, for Black neighborhoods and communities, especially as we, witness, more challenges with affordability and other changes. I know that we'll talk more about later.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie, because I definitely want to underscore that point that you made about, these policy windows that do exist and then how do we make use of them. And, Harsha, I'd love to also get you to jump in here because we are talking about what to do when you may not have access to certain data. And I'm also thinking about what happens when the lead organizations that might be trying to utilize the data may be under-resourced or just not have the ability to stitch together what they need to in order to understand either where the disparity is, where there might be wealth extraction, or even some of the promising solutions. So to that point, Harsha, I'm very curious if you have any thoughts of what are some alternative avenues to collect some of these data, and especially for those more under-resourced, smaller teams that would have similar questions.
Thank you, Kimberly. This is a great question. Like, we spend a lot of time just thinking about existing data gaps. My team has undertaken a body of work where we talk to researchers such as Michael to understand like what are the questions that they have and to like fully understand the state of Black wealth. And then we map those questions to existing data sets to see how many of those questions can actually be answered by the data that we have today. That can also inform like future data collection practices. For example, in the topic of business ownership, something as fundamental as like the count of Black businesses at a city level is not like publicly available. This data is only available at a county level. So when cities come to us and ask us, like, I want to know like how many Black businesses are in my city, where are they? Like, we don't actually have an answer. But the Blackville Data Center, we also think of ourselves as like a data solution provider. One thing we've done is like we've scraped data from Yelp on Black businesses, and we've merged that data with like few additional data sets that have some information on Black businesses at a local level, and we've created a unique data set that is now available on our Local Wealth Explorer platform. This is just one example of how, as a tech team, looking at the quality of data, like we can offer some solutions. We've also taken like 8 different data sets and we've combined it together to create a business investment index, where this data goes down to a local level, down to a census tract level. And if you're a capital mover and you're interested in identifying neighborhoods within your city, within your community, to speed up small business growth, you can use our business investment index to identify like businesses you want to invest within those business investment index zones. Michael actually talked a little bit about intergenerational wealth transfer. This is something that like a lot of us are like really passionate about and trying to understand and making sure data around intergenerational wealth transfer is available at a local level. One thing that I'll point out is that as the baby boomer generation is retiring, we are about to witness one of the largest wealth transfers in the history of the United States. I think this estimated to be around between 60 to 70 trillion dollar wealth transfer that would occur from one generation to another. And we really need data that is granular, that is disaggregated by race to really understand at a community level the impact of this intergenerational wealth transfer that is supposed to happen in this decade. Again, here as a data solution provider, one thing the Blackwell Data Center has done, actually in consultation and feedback from Michael, is to quantify a methodology and put together like the amount of Tangle titles in cities and scaling this across 36 cities, not just the number of Tangle titles, but also how much equity is currently stuck in Tangle titles that can be unlocked if cities can provide legal services and families and underserved communities actually have a clear line of will and transfer of assets. So these are like just a few examples and how we are thinking about also providing solutions to existing data gaps.
Mhm. Thanks, Harshan. Especially on this topic of generational wealth, I think this is a great opportunity to weave in one of our audience questions that came in the box. Um, we have these phenomenons that we're seeing in cities right now. We're seeing white flight from the city center. We are seeing, present day gentrification. So this is one of the questions that we have. How does that impact generational wealth accumulation for Black people? And Michael, I wonder if you want to jump in on this, especially based on some of the titling work that you're doing.
Yeah, gosh, such an excellent question, and can be, addressed in a number of different ways. You know, let me say a couple of things. First, certainly, in response to economic development, I think what we certainly see is the risk of displacement increasing. And its implications, I think, for the wealth gap are at least twofold. The first one is obviously, the possibility that you might leave forcibly. But some additional research then finds that Black families that leave, in turn, will move to areas that are economically more abundant themselves. And so the combination, kind of that flow of them leaving and then where they settle, itself, the combination of those two can contribute to greater wealth differences. But I'll also say that even if, you wind up saying, certainly, there are additional cost pressures that you can face and that are consistent with more rapid economic development. One of the ones that comes to my mind is certainly around property taxes and the evidence that we do find that property taxes and the burden of property taxes can itself increase in the face of economic development. Certainly something like, a tax abatement, and homestead kind of policies can all help to limit their impact. But certainly when you couple that with the condition of the property, with affordability challenges that those households may already be facing, it really speaks to a difficult challenge. And then let me say just more generally and just build on kind of some of a point that Harsha made there, and that is let's scoping out to the northern migration. A big kind of instance of population mobility, in which a number of Black people moved from the South, oftentimes to the North, to the Midwest, places like Toledo and Cleveland and Detroit. My parents, my great grandparents moved to Cleveland, and worked for the manufacturing industry there. And one of the issues that really happened was the properties that were left, the properties that were acquired post post formal slavery, oftentimes did not themselves have were not passed off with clear title. And that in turn has resulted in and contributed to this challenge around heirs property. Really not knowing, who owns it, and that the title of that property, not being clear, at least within the legal framework that we live under. And that in and of itself can have a lot of implications. Obviously, the ultimate one is the potential for wealth loss, but it itself could contribute to economic development. That is the degree to which heirs property, which is consistent with multiple people owning the home, or fractional ownership, or tenancy in common, depending on the term that you like to use, can result in a business actually purchasing one piece of that ownership, and then in turn forcing the sale of the property itself, and then buying it back at rock bottom prices. And so that then becomes a situation where not only is the property lost to that family, but it can also enrich within the conditions of economic development, can also enrich the new owner. So, the point there is, in the face of economic development, certainly leaving the community, ultimately where you settle. But then what do we do with that property? A lot of was talked about wealth transfer. Certainly for people of color, for Black families in particular, that home is typically the asset that they have and they hope to transfer.
Mhm.
Issues like heirs property can keep that from happening, and ultimately contribute to greater wealth over generations, as Leslie pointed out.
Michael, that's such an excellent point. And I think there are some nuances here that really have to do with like cultural realities of Black households. And so I would be remiss if we don't have a conversation here about, we're thinking about all these wealth metrics, we're measuring what's happening over time, but how does this really overlay with some of the realities and aspirations for Black families? Like there has to be some reasons why we are not seeing this sort of passed down in the same traditional mechanisms. And Leslie, I don't know if you want to jump in on this and share any quick thoughts.
Sure, I'll try to be quick, and I do want to share just a bit about we talk about culture and families. I think, we would be remiss to not talk about the centrality of Black women in the workforce as a sort of core component of what it means, like Black families, Black wealth building, um, and improving the overall, economic condition of Black families requires us to think about Black women's experiences in the labor market, in the economy more broadly. So Black women continue to face significant racial and gender-based disparities in wages and income and retirement savings and student loan debt and all of these areas. And I know that, a statistic that a lot of us have been hearing lately is that, just this year, I believe it's between February and April, some 300,000 Black women have lost jobs or have left the workforce. And I think it's important to note just two things. One, that Black women's employment also declined in 2024. But the attention that this more recent drop is getting is because it is sharper and it is more pronounced, and it is, again, rightfully getting attention. But I think we also need to pay attention to the fact that Black women who are sort of counted among that 300,000 tend to be concentrated in professional jobs. And I think we need to think really seriously about like what that means for households, for families where, 1 in 4 Black households are led economically by Black women, and that in 70% of all Black households, Black women are economic contributors. So there's been a clear deterioration in the labor market for Black workers this year with the unemployment rising and employment rate falling. But it's important to note that the decline in Black workers' employment is concentrated among Black women, and that Black men's employment rates actually tend to be more stable. Um, and again, this concentration in job loss has been in professional and business services, it's been in manufacturing, and it has been in the federal government. So those are sort of the likely causes for Black women's decline in employment and the displacement that we're seeing in Black women in the workforce. And so I'll just end by saying there's a lot that we can do, both at the local, state, and federal level, to support Black women's economic security and ability to build wealth, and that has, sweeping implications or consequences for Black families.
Mhm. Thank you, Leslie. And, I cannot believe that we are almost up with time, but I do want to ask a rapid fire question for the panelists just as we close out. And this one came from one of our audience Q&A. What is one thing that you see as the next potential step as we are talking about closing the racial wealth gap in the coming years? It can be one thing to do with data, it can be one thing on partnerships. If you had to say one quick note for the audience, what would it be? And Harsha, I'm going to have you start us off with this.
No pressure. Uh, I think like I'll talk about the data side. Like this year, we've seen like a lot of shocks to the federal data infrastructure. So I'm hopeful that just the example that Leslie shared about like local data collection can spur and scale with right investments from philanthropy and the private sector. That is something that I'll keep an eye out for. Thank you.
Thanks, Harsha. Michael, go ahead. Give us your one
Yeah.
thing.
Yep. I'm gonna give two sides of the same coin, which is a trick way for me giving two things, but it's one thing. Sorry. But really quickly, one of the things that's been top of my mind has certainly been around longevity risk. We know that we know oftentimes that Black families don't have the retirement savings that are needed to maintain to the end, but we also know that oftentimes they what they do have is actually life insurance. And what we found is that if you include the life insurance payouts into their measure of wealth, some measure of transferable wealth, life insurance becomes second to home ownership. Because in fact, senior Black families are more likely to have life insurance compared to senior white families, the reverse of the wealth gap that we've talked about. So for me, that's a quick way of like, what are ways that we can use this tool to help people around kind of that death to make sure that that wealth is transferred appropriately.
Great. Thanks, Michael. And Leslie, I'll have you close us out.
Yeah. So I'll just say really quickly, I care tremendously about affordability. And I think that if we are going to make any significant or measurable progress on like individual and household wealth, we have to get, housing, childcare, food, healthcare costs and affordability under control. And we have to take some proactive measures and steps to increase and improve folks' wages at all levels of employment.
Yeah, thank you. These are all such great points. I appreciate everyone for joining us for today's webinar. Let's give a virtual round of applause for our fantastic speakers. Thank you to you all. And we invite everyone in the audience to dig into all the materials and links that we've shared during today's conversation. And finally, if you could go ahead and take our survey that's dropped in the chat, please go ahead and do so we can hear more about what things you're interested in and how we can support you all in doing this work. I know several questions came in, so whichever ones we're able to continue answering, we will. And otherwise, please just look at the event page as we upload the recording and any other materials that were shared today. So with that, thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great day.